Piranha Bytes was a German video game developer who formed in 1997 and operated for 27 years before shutting down in 2024. Known for their work on the Gothic, Risen, and Elex series of action role-playing games, their typical design formula revolved around smaller open worlds with handcrafted environments, meaningful exploration, immersive atmospheres, challenging difficulty curves, dynamic and rewarding progression systems, and a general lack of hand-holding that expected you to solve problems and figure things out on your own. As a result of their small staff and limited budgets, their games were usually subject to varying degrees of polish, or perhaps lack thereof, which often left them feeling unrefined and somewhat clunky in their technical execution. However, there was an unmistakable charm to their games that lent them a unique heart and soul that was difficult, if not outright impossible, to find in other similar types of games by seemingly much more capable developers. Thus, Piranha Bytes managed to maintain a loyal following of die-hard fans over their quarter-century tenure as niche developers creating niche games for a niche audience. That run of sustained but modest success came to an end in 2024, with Piranha Bytes becoming one of many casualties in the industry-wide Embracer Group fiasco, as a result of Embracer's overzealous and short-sighted business strategy combined with lower-than-expected sales of Piranha Bytes' latest game, Elex 2, which released in March of 2022 to mixed reviews. With no more future Piranha Bytes games to look forward to, and with me having recently finished replaying each one for the sake of this channel, now would seem like the appropriate time to reflect on their completed catalog and try to evaluate their relative successes and failures, while putting their games in some attempt at a ranked order based on their overall quality, lasting legacy, and just my own personal tastes and preferences. At the risk of spoiling my own rankings, most if not all Piranha Bytes fans will tell you that they were at their best in their early days with the surprise success of Gothic 1 and 2, their first two games, but then ultimately spent the entire rest of their career struggling to recapture the magic that made those two games so special. Basically every subsequent game was a mixed bag of seemingly good intentions combined with occasionally weird design choices or some degree of lackluster technical execution, or else some other form of unfortunate limitation that ultimately left each one feeling like a missed opportunity in some way or another. There were glimpses of their original magic along the way, of course, and there was usually always some compelling reason to play each subsequent game, but I think for many of us it was often on the pure hope of them delivering another masterpiece like Gothic 1 and 2. That day would never come, sadly, but that's not to say they didn't produce some really fun and entertaining games besides those two. While the top two games in my own rankings should come as no surprise to anyone, there are still interesting points of discussion between those two, since Gothic 1 and 2, while incredibly similar, do have some notable differences that might make one of them the definitively better game to different people, and so I'll try to cover all those perspectives when I get up towards the top of the list. I've gone over this subject previously in another video I made 5 years ago, in which I basically say that I don't even like to consider them separate games, but more as two halves of a single game. However, for the sake of these rankings, I'm going to separate them and try to make a definitive selection as to which one I ultimately like more or deem to be the superior game. The rest of the list is where things get a little more complicated, since with a few exceptions there aren't many clear-cut distinctions where I can easily say that one game is conclusively better or worse than another, and community sentiment is likewise all over the place, with some of these games being held in deeply passionate high regard by some people and absolutely scorned by others. I'm going to try to consider as many different angles for each game as I can, like how much did I enjoy each game in its original context when it was brand new, how much did I enjoy replaying it years later, how much does it capture the original magic of those early Piranha Bytes games, how good is it individually just on its own merits alone, not necessarily as a Piranha Bytes game, plus other considerations like where does it fit in the legacy of Piranha Bytes' trajectory or the overall impact I feel it's had on the community since its release. I'm not always going to explicitly discuss every one of these criteria for every game, but that just gives you an idea of the types of thoughts I'm putting into everything. Although I'm going to try to be objective with all these considerations for why I would rank one game higher than another, at the end of the day these decisions are ultimately going to be influenced by my own personal feelings with regards to which games I like better, plain and simple, so there's going to be an inherent degree of subjective bias in these rankings. Bear in mind that these are my personal rankings. I'm not trying to claim this as some universal truth or that anyone else's rankings are wrong, so if you disagree with anything, don't take it personally, but feel free to express why you think differently in the comments. Regardless, I'd encourage everyone to share your own rankings and comment on why certain games are your favorites, so that the comment section can represent the greater fandom at large and not just my own opinions. And while you're down there, maybe like and subscribe as well if you haven't already. I should also note that I've been a fan of Piranha Bytes since 2003, after first discovering them through Gothic 1, and was an active day one purchaser of all their subsequent games as they were coming out. I've also played each game multiple times, both when it was brand new and again years later, and have likewise covered every single game on this list previously, both on my blog and on YouTube, sometimes even reviewing the same game 10 years apart. I'm going to try to be somewhat brief in these explanations so that the video doesn't turn into a series of full-length reviews for every single game, so bear in mind that I'm just trying to give a general overview of some of the more important thoughts I have on each game. This is not meant to be a comprehensive representation of all my thoughts or every possible consideration on each game. If you'd like to hear more about a specific game, then I'd encourage you to check out my other videos and articles where I usually go into more elaborate detail, or else ask in the comments for more clarification and I can respond to you there. I'm going to break the video into chapters for each specific game as they go in ranked order, from the bottom up, but there may be some overlap where comparisons between different games occur in the section for a higher ranked game, so discussion for each individual game isn't strictly limited to that game's specific entry. And of course, there will almost certainly be spoilers in this video, since it's covering so many games where you often need context from other games to understand the distinctions being made between them. I'll try not to ruin important details, but all the same, this video is intended for people who've already played all the games, so you should just be mindful of that and be warned that there may be some minor spoilers here and there. With that preamble out of the way, let's get to the actual rankings.
Thanks for your help. We'll meet in the old camp.
Gothic 3 released in the fall of 2006 as the final entry in the Gothic trilogy, which began with the original Gothic in 2001. After vanquishing a demonic god and saving the prison colony in Gothic 1, and then saving the island of Corinus from the armies of darkness in Gothic 2, the nameless hero and company set sail for the mainland in Gothic 3 on a quest to find Zardus, your mysterious necromancer friend who left your group at the end of Gothic 2, to figure out what he's planning. Oh, and you can maybe optionally take a side in the human-orc war by liberating human cities from orcish control, or eliminating rebel camps who are trying to oppose the orcish occupation of Murtana. Gothic 3 represents a major stylistic shift from the first two games, with it being built on a brand new in-house engine and focusing on an uncharacteristically massive open world with a completely non-linear main questline. The goal at the time was seemingly to be able to compete with Morrowind and subsequently Oblivion, which was in development at the same time Piranha Bytes was working on Gothic 3, but they wound up biting off way more than they could chew with trying to create an entirely new engine from scratch and also develop a much bigger and more complex game than they were used to, while also still having half of their team working on the expansion content for Gothic 2, Night of the Raven, in the early stages of Gothic 3's development. Any one of those extenuating circumstances probably would have posed a challenge to getting Gothic 3 done sufficiently, but attempting all of them at the same time likely set them up for failure, as it eventually became apparent that they would not meet their originally planned release date in the first quarter of 2006, which is coincidentally the same time that Oblivion wound up releasing. After multiple delays, they were forced to release the game in the fall, at least 7 months later, in what was effectively an unfinished state, full of bugs and technical issues, unfulfilled ideas, and lots of rushed filler content that could only generously be called placeholders for what I presume was meant to be much more fleshed out, if only they'd had more time to continue working on things. I really cannot stress enough just how bad Gothic 3 was at launch. The game ran poorly on most systems with low, stuttery frame rates, interminably long load times, and constant crashes making the game literally unplayable for some people. Quest scripting would often break down and prevent you from finishing important quests, including the main quest itself. Save files would even sometimes get corrupted. There were tons of random glitches making the game look and feel like a complete shit show, and the melee combat was utterly broken with ridiculous stun-locking hyper animations from enemies that were a guaranteed kill if they triggered that attack pattern, which was incredibly often.
You asked for it.
It was frankly miserable trying to play Gothic 3 at launch in the fall of 2006. A lot of people are quick to blame the publisher Joe Wood for this and give Piranha Bytes a pass, since it was ultimately Joe Wood's decision to release the game in that state, but I'd say Piranha Bytes share as much, if not more, of the blame for themselves. Let's not forget, this is a business where the two parties entered a contract agreement wherein Joe Wood would pay Piranha Bytes to produce a product in a set amount of time, and Piranha Bytes failed to deliver that product even after being given a 7-month extension. And it's not like Joe Wood had an unlimited amount of funds to say, no worries, take all the time you need to make the best game you possibly can. The game was going to have to release at some point, and at the rate Piranha Bytes was going, they may never have finished it in any reasonable amount of time. Mike Hoga, the lead project manager for all 3 Gothic games, freely admits that it was their own fault that they didn't make good use of their time and didn't fulfill their end of the contract.
So they just took it from our hands and put it on the market, so to speak. But to be fair again, it was us who took the time, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like they took it away prematurely in words of contract. Just we took too long. Right? Anyway, it's just not ready, right? We failed in being punctual.
So at the end of the day, Piranha Bytes deserves blame for not delivering what they promised and for setting unrealistic goals for themselves in the first place.
And by react differently, you mean avoid the game to be shipped in a premature state.
Yes.
Just block it.
No, just maybe earlier, at an earlier stage, you can have some decisions like maybe we don't need 12 monsters. Maybe we can have resources free here and put them elsewhere and shift it and make it happen, right? Not only more time isn't always the solution. Right?
The way I see it, Gothic 3 was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning, with aspirations of being an Elder Scrolls competitor instead of just being a good Gothic game. Coming off the heels of Gothic 1 and 2, when you think about Gothic, you think of a small, handcrafted world densely packed with meaningful content at every turn, an immersive setting with living NPCs and creatures where every single thing makes believable sense, surprisingly complex quest design with NPCs having realistic motivations and there often being different ways to approach how you solve an objective based on the story implications or your own methodology, a rewarding progression system that feels like your character is actually evolving with new attack animations and expanding functionality and spell effects, a combat system that balances player skill against character stats in a satisfying way, enemy designs that follow a sensible hierarchy where you can intuit just by looking at creatures why one would be stronger than another, a faction system that shapes your gameplay with unique skills and armor while also granting a different perspective on the story with optional side quests, hand-placed loot where everything is intentional and feels purposeful, recurring locations with dynamic events happening in old locations to lend the world a strong feeling of persistence within a dynamic story, and just so many other things, both major and minor, all of which wind up being completely subverted in Gothic 3. With Gothic 3, we instead get a massive world with a lot more empty space between meaningful bits of content, a world full of unbelievable situations that don't make any kind of logical sense, including the core premise of the game with the way orcs and humanity are treating the supposed war, straightforward quests with shallow and repetitive objectives, a more passive progression system that, at its core, emphasizes simply increasing background numbers to improve your damage values, a mindless click-fest combat system with greatly reduced need for player skill, enemy difficulties that are all over the place with orcs being some of the easiest enemies in the game to defeat at level 1 and things like wolves or wild boars being the most fearsome, devastating enemies even to high-level players, a more abstract faction system where you never actually join a faction and where picking a side has practically no influence on your character's skills, loot that's been both randomized and set to scale depending on how many special chests you've opened previously, thus removing the meaningful intention behind enemy rewards and loot placement, a map design with no real sense of persistent continuity since pretty much every location is designed to be visited once, completing all the content therein, and then basically never having any reason to ever return to that location again, and just so many other things, like the complete disregard for established characters and lore that combine to make Gothic 3 feel like a different game altogether. Now, there are certainly arguments we could make to say that Gothic 3 is a better alternative to something like Oblivion, by pointing to its much more detailed and engaging world design, its really charming atmosphere with the environmental design and music, the complete lack of loading screens leading to stronger immersion, no ridiculous enemy scaling completely trivializing the progression system, the quests requiring you to find everything on your own versus simply following a marker on the compass, and so on. Some will even argue in Gothic 3's favor over the first two Gothics by pointing to all the open world freedom to just go where you want and do what you want, or having the ability to pick different sides in the war and change the outlook of each city. In light of that, a common sentiment I often see is that Gothic 3 may be a bad Gothic game, but it's still a good game. However, I just can't get behind that logic, because even disregarding all the ways that it departs from the established Gothic formula and trying to treat it as its own standalone game, we're still left with a game that has an overabundance of utterly shallow, mindless MMORPG-style quests that have been copy-pasted ad nauseum across the entire game, which I do not find in any way satisfying or engaging to complete. A ridiculous, broken melee combat system that is possibly the worst I've ever experienced in a game like this, and which, along with archery, is functionally incompatible with the core premise of these large-scale battles while liberating cities. And no, the alternative AI from the community patch doesn't fix any of this, in fact it arguably makes it worse. Practically no story or main quest line, which I feel would have helped lend a stronger sense of purpose to everything you're doing in the open world, while what little of this does exist is completely underwhelming and anticlimactic. Scaled loot progression that forces you to go through the same equipment progression in the same order for every single playthrough, and still plenty of nonsensical design elements making this world seem more like an artificial video game playground than an actual believable world. So to me, Gothic 3 is not just a bad Gothic game, but it's a bad game just in general. I've played it 3 times now, once when it first launched in 2006, a year or 2 later after the community patch came out, and then again a decade later, and I found that my appreciation for Gothic 3 has gotten worse each time. Ironically, the technical experience improved each time with better versions of patches and better computer hardware to run the game more smoothly. But with each playthrough, I just found myself getting more and more fed up with all the issues that the patch doesn't fix, which are unfortunately all incredibly central to the game's core design. Maybe if they'd actually achieved their vision, it could have been good and I would have been pleasantly surprised by it, but I'm not going to defend the game based on non-existent theoretical speculation. The fact remains that the game they created is literally unfinished and would have remained a broken mess if not for the community banding together to supposedly fix it for them. And that, I think, is reason enough to put it at the bottom. I suppose if you mod the hell out of it and change almost everything about it, then yes, Gothic 3 could still be a phenomenal game, but that's not the game Piranha Bytes created, so I'm not going to give them credit for other people's work. Besides that, I'm not sure the massive, open-world Elder Scrolls-style formula is what most fans of Gothic 1 and 2 actually wanted in the first place when going into a third and final installment of their beloved series. And even when you fix all of the technical problems with things like the community patch, or willfully ignore all the ways in which it doesn't live up to the expectations of the previous games in order to treat it as its own standalone game, it still has major problems. So I can't in good conscience put it anywhere but the bottom of my rankings. Risen 2: Dark Waters released in April 2012 as a follow-up to Risen in 2009. After saving the island of Faranga from the possible destruction of the Fire Titan in the first game, the War of the Titans and Titan Lords has continued raging on the mainland, forcing humanity to flee across the southern seas, which are now being terrorized by a new Titan Lord named Mara and her pet Kraken, in hopes of reaching the safety of the new, undiscovered lands to the south. Your goal is to work with various feuding pirate captains as you sail to various islands to obtain the 4 mystical Titan artifacts so that you can defeat Mara and ensure the future of humanity. Many Gothic fans viewed the first Risen as a return to form after the huge misstep of Gothic 3, and so there is a fair amount of hope among the community that Risen 2 could represent the same sort of evolution that Gothic 2 brought to that series, by carrying over the core mechanics of Risen 1 and expanding on them with more depth, new features, and more polish, while setting the game on a bigger island, maybe even the mainland itself, alongside an all-new story, of course. Instead, Piranha Bytes pulled another Gothic 3 and decided to change literally everything about the sequel, this time seeming to emulate BioWare games versus Bethesda games with Gothic 3, instead of simply trying to be a good follow-up to Risen. Instead of the first game's more traditional sword and sorcery style, late medieval fantasy setting, they switched it to a more modern Renaissance-era pirate setting replete with firearms. The old combat system that relied on timed actions and reactions was replaced with a really stiff clickfest where you couldn't block monster attacks or even dodge whatsoever, at least not until these features were patched in a month later, and instead had to rely on weird gimmicky features like dirty tricks and pistols. Elemental magic was completely removed in favor of using voodoo to manipulate or control enemies indirectly. Instead of having a singular large open world map, it was divided into a bunch of smaller islands, seemingly just so they could sell extra islands as DLC. The leveling system that used to rely on traditional level ups was instead made into a more open system of gaining glory points and applying those points directly into various attribute increases. The main story premise was changed from defeating titans to fleeing from warring titan lords, with lots of bizarre changes to the lore and setting to accommodate these retcons. The traditional 3-faction system was replaced with a 2-faction system where you don't even get to join your chosen faction or advance through their ranks. And the game's more linear, chapter-based main questline was made to be mostly non-linear, with acquiring the 4 Titan artifacts in whatever order, based on the order you explore the various islands. This is in addition to tons of other all-new uncharacteristic features like persistent companion characters, a slow-motion kill cam, a major emphasis on cutscenes and more cinematic storytelling, quick-time events, and gimmicky mini-games, to name just a few examples. In a way, this radical departure from everything that made Risen 1 so good is actually worse than what they did with Gothic 3, because at least with that game you can see that they were trying to stay somewhat within the realm of the themes and gameplay concepts they established in the previous 2 games, while just putting a different spin on things and I guess trying to update it for a more modern mainstream audience. Here, it's almost like they created a brand new series IP entirely that had zero basis on the Risen franchise whatsoever, and then retroactively tried to paste a bunch of familiar names and concepts onto it so they could bank on the relative success of Risen 1 to boost the sequel's initial sales figures. Lead project manager Mike Hoga took less of a leadership role with Risen 2 and subsequently expressed being burnt out from spending 15 years feeling like he was making the same game over and over again, even opting to leave Piranha Bytes during this time in order to pursue his own creative interests. So I can certainly sympathize with the team's desires to do something different besides the usual fantasy RPG setting with Risen 2. However, changing literally everything that people liked from Risen 1 in order to make a different sort of game altogether, and then selling it to that same crowd on the basis of it being a sequel, feels like a bait and switch that frankly rubbed me and a lot of other fans the wrong way. It didn't help matters that Risen 2 launched with a lot of bugs and technical problems, not to mention seemingly missing features, making it easily their second worst game in terms of the state it was in at launch. In fairness, they did at least get the chance to fix a lot of things with patches, something they couldn't fully do with Gothic 3, which they eventually had to abandon after separating from their publisher. But it was of course too little too late to benefit all the loyal fans who'd bought the game at launch and finished playing it before these major fixes and new features were subsequently introduced. Beyond that, a lot of the actual gameplay mechanics are just poorly conceived and poorly executed, making it hard to appreciate any of the stylistic changes when the actual gameplay can only be described as mediocre at best. Exploration is not very satisfying due to the simplistic map designs and lack of rewarding loot to find, especially in conjunction with the lack of freeform climbing and swimming, which makes exploration much more straightforward. Combat is a huge mess in general, with guns being ridiculously overpowered with shallow, repetitive point-and-click gameplay, melee being extremely clunky with unresponsive attack prompts and animations, and the voodoo magic being largely ineffective at actually defeating enemies. The leveling system leaves a lot to be desired, with so many skills feeling pointless, insufficiently fleshed out, or just more annoying than in their other games. And the faction system underwhelms by not really having a significant impact on your character development or your perspective on the story, outside of one chapter basically, since you're forced to play a more generic pirate character regardless of your faction choice. The net effect is that the actual gameplay is often more frustrating than it is fun. There's also some shady business practices going on behind the scenes, where 2 of the game's islands were created as part of the game's primary development cycle, but were seemingly cut out from the final release in order to be sold piecemeal to artificially inflate the game's price as Day 1 DLC. These islands were actually included on the manufactured disc at launch, and could be played in their entirety by using console commands to unlock them. Buying the DLC simply activated them officially and let you download the speech files for them. This may ultimately have been the publisher's idea and not really Piranha Bytes' fault, but the end result is all the same, with having to fork out extra cash for the complete game experience, and with probably the most interesting bit of side content being locked behind a paywall. That being Patty's Quest in the Treasure Isle DLC, which incidentally is also one of the few instances in which Risen 2 actually feels like some semblance of a continuation from Risen 1. With all of that in mind, there's an easy case to be made that Risen 2 should actually be ranked lower than Gothic 3, so why do I have it higher? Quite simply, because I like Risen 2 more. If you put a gun to my head and forced me to play one of Gothic 3 or Risen 2, I'd pick Risen 2 every time, because for as bad as both games are, in terms of their technical execution and how they live up to the expectations set by the previous games in their respective series, at least Risen 2 has a fun and interesting story and a pretty compelling main questline. I would even go so far as to say that Risen 2 has the best storytelling of any Piranha Bytes game, which is not necessarily the same thing as having the best story, since it is ultimately kind of video gamey with the overarching objective being to gather 4 MacGuffins so you can fight the final boss. But it has really good characters with fully developed narrative arcs around each island, which fully integrate the map design and side quests to complement the main quest, where each island by itself is essentially its own chapter of the story, with major cinematic set pieces and exciting things happening at each step of the way to keep things interesting. I actually really enjoy following the main quest in Risen 2, and the pirate theme is something I likewise really appreciate, so it's easier for me to stomach all the bad gameplay to just focus on those aspects. With Gothic 3, there's no strong hook I can latch onto to motivate me to put up with all of its problems, hence Gothic 3 being lower in my rankings. Elex 2 released in March 2022 as the follow-up to Elex, which released 5 years prior and established this new setting that blends traditional fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalypse elements by way of a magical substance called Elex, which arrived on a comet that struck the fictional planet of Magellan, forever changing its ecosystems as different factions formed to harness the power of Elex in different ways. After defeating an order of bad guys in Elex 1 who are hell-bent on conquering all life on the planet in their efforts to harvest all Elex for some greater purpose, Elex 2 takes place several years later when an alien invasion force arrives to once again threaten all life on the planet, forcing Jax, the main character of both games, to unite the factions and find a way to stop them. Elex 2 is a difficult game for me to rank, because on the one hand it makes a lot of objective improvements to the core gameplay of Elex, which I obviously have ranked higher by virtue of it having not yet appeared in these rankings, but on the other hand, Elex 2 somehow manages to do some things worse than Elex 1, despite having had a record amount of time and budget behind it.
Not only more time isn't always the solution.
Yeah.
Right?
On the bright side, its melee combat is probably the most fluid and responsive they've ever developed, with its smooth animations and more varied type of offensive and defensive maneuvers you can execute, but it loses major points for not incorporating any meaningful progression systems by unlocking new types of special attacks or improved combos like you can do in many of Piranha Bytes' other games, and by streamlining the amount of different weapon types into significantly fewer options. The new improvements to the jetpack, with being able to upgrade it and zip around the map with sprint boosters, are a lot of fun, but then by the same token there's a weird lack of rewarding discoveries when it comes to vertical exploration, and it's ridiculously easy to unlock all of its upgrades very early in the game. They brought back one of my favorite things from Gothic 2 when letting you visit familiar locations that have undergone some sort of major change, so that you get the nostalgia of seeing these locations in a new context and can experience them for the first time all over again, but they messed it up by changing everything too much to the point that it's barely recognizable and comes off more like a poor imitation of the real thing. The faction quests are all exceptionally well done, with lots of unique gameplay scenarios complete with scripted events given to you by interesting characters, thus making these some of the best of any Piranha Bytes game. But then the main questline falls completely flat, with the first half feeling like tedious busy work, and the second half devolving into mindless excuses to have you fight hordes of enemies, 30 to 40 at a time, over and over and over again. The actual story tries to do something new by giving the main character a child, but Dex isn't woven into the story properly, so his whole involvement just feels awkward and forced. Meanwhile, the plot progression follows the exact same formula and beats as Elex 1, with the ending leaving us in exactly the same narrative situation we were in at the end of Elex 1, which makes the entire plot of Elex 2 feel like pointless, repetitive filler content meant to bridge the gap to a third game that we would ultimately never get, since Piranha Bytes went out of business a few years after finishing Elex 2. That's not even to mention all the nonsensical storytelling where so many things just aren't explained properly, or all the unfortunate retcons they had to make by picking so many canonical outcomes from the first game and thus completely disregarding the player's unique role-playing decisions. Other things feel like they're just straight up worse, like with the role-playing mechanics that carry over all the same elements from Elex 1, but while removing all the complexity and nuance of the cold system in favor of the more generic good versus evil destruction meter. Companion characters are supposed to have their own likes and dislikes and will react to your role-playing either positively or negatively, but there's no coherent logic to their various proclivities since there are weird overlaps and contradictions that make it impossible to reliably predict how any character will react to any given situation. Companion quests are supposed to help expand on their characterization, but wind up being obnoxious filler content where you do the same basic tasks in similar situations over and over and over again. The world design lost a lot of its color and more unique environmental designs, while the character models give everyone a slightly uncanny valley effect, so despite having much higher fidelity graphical processing power, everything looks stylistically worse. And the progression system is completely ruined by their use of level scaling enemies, which is a fundamental contradiction to the very definition of Piranha Bytes game. That alone is a major slap in the face to their longtime fans and almost makes me want to put Elex 2 on the bottom just on principle alone. So why isn't Elex on the bottom? Well, for starters, because it wasn't anywhere near the huge technical disaster that Gothic 3 and Risen 2 were on launch, and because it actually follows the established precedents of its series instead of veering off into some unwanted direction and trying to pass itself off as still being part of that series. And for all its faults, Elex 2 still has fairly competent gameplay, which is more than I can say about different aspects of Gothic 3 or Risen 2, with both of them having utterly abysmal, frustrating combat systems, and Gothic 3 having easily the worst quests of any Piranha Bytes game. So for me, Elex 2 easily trumps both of those games. And it's not like it's a completely terrible game by any means. Its first half is actually really fun when you're first getting into everything, experiencing all the new gameplay mechanics and exploring the world for the first time and doing all the various faction quests. It's mainly just in the second half when things start going downhill as all the other shortcomings start becoming more noticeable, and with the tedious, shallow, repetitive main questline that makes you want the game to end sooner rather than later. In the grand scheme of things, I'm lumping Elex 2 in with Gothic 3 and Risen 2 near the bottom of my rankings simply because of all the missed potential that it represents. Every other game that I have higher on my list was either a direct improvement over something that came before it, or else had a creative, innovative spark behind it that I really appreciate. Piranha Bytes had a really solid blueprint to work with after Elex 1, with that game having lots of fun and interesting ideas and obvious room for improvement, but they didn't exactly carry over the strongest aspects of Elex 1, or really fix all the problems that needed to be fixed, and they didn't expand on the gameplay mechanics or content features as much as they really should have. When all of their previous games were developed in the span of only 2 or 3 years with presumably lower budgets, and you see them suddenly have a whopping 5 years of development time and being backed by the biggest publisher they've ever had, with a solid foundation in Elex 1 to build off of, there's really no excuse for Elex 2 not being better than it turned out. This absolutely could have been a home run in the same way that Gothic 2 felt like a bigger, better version of Gothic 1 in most regards, but instead they barely hit the ball out of the infield and then awkwardly tripped while rounding first base, resulting in an embarrassing base hit single. Like, sure, the game was okay and they did at least get on base, but it could have easily been at least a double or a triple if they had just done a better job. It's technically better than some other games I'm going to have higher in my rankings, but I'm docking major points for the sheer disappointment of not living up to its potential. Risen 3 Titan Lords released in August 2014, a little over 2 years after Risen 2, and for the third time in the Risen series represents an odd shift in the narrative, this time with the central premise of Titans and warring Titan Lords being replaced with a spirit necromancer from the underworld who's trying to conquer the world, I guess? You play a different character from the previous games, now the nameless half-brother to Patty, who's been your long-running ally throughout the series, on a quest to recover your lost soul after it's taken from you in the introduction, and then stop Necroloth from unleashing his undead hordes on the world. Whereas Risen 2 pivoted into a completely different direction from Risen 1, Risen 3 sticks a little more closely to the themes and gameplay concepts that were established in Risen 2, albeit with a concerted effort to go back to their roots by attempting to inject more of that traditional Gothic feel into it with a little bit more of a dark fantasy theme versus being overtly and exclusively pirate themed, and with a return to the usual 3-faction system with ranks and progression therein, in addition to several Easter eggs and references that will appeal to longtime Gothic fans. At its core, however, Risen 3 bears a lot of the Risen 2 DNA, which a lot of people didn't like very much in the first place. When I reviewed the game back in 2014, one of my ultimate conclusions was that it felt more like Risen 2.5 than a proper Risen 3, in the sense that it was just an improved version of what Risen 2 probably should have been in the first place, instead of being a full, independent iteration of the series. From what I can tell, a lot of people dismiss Risen 3 as being one of the worst of Piranha Bytes' games purely because of that association with Risen 2, but it's really not that bad. In fact, it's a direct improvement over Risen 2 in almost every way. The combat is much more smooth and functional, the spells are actively engaging with all factions having access to different types of unique spell abilities, there's way more fun variety of content to experience, the new islands are much bigger and more detailed, exploration is more rewarding with better loot to find and while also reinstating climbing and swimming for extra player agency in finding hidden areas, your ship now actually serves a mechanical function in the gameplay, and it actually launched in a relatively polished, finished state. So for those reasons alone, it should be unsurprisingly higher than Risen 2 in my rankings. Where Risen 3 suffers relative to Risen 2, and in fact many of Piranha Bytes' other games, is primarily in the storytelling and the main quest. The story, frankly, is uninteresting and feels ridiculously contrived, while the bulk of the main quest feels like arbitrary busy work that you accomplish as a byproduct of just exploring the world and completing optional side content. It's very much a victim of just being an excuse to give you a bunch of non-linear objectives to complete in the open world, like kill X number of Shadow Lords, and close X number of portals, and recruit X number of allied ships, and gather X number of mystics to restore your soul, as opposed to being about telling an actual story. Consequently, a lot of the game's content is front-loaded in the first chapter, with not a whole lot of new content being added later in the game to replace completed content. So in effect, you spend a ton of time in the open world exploring, defeating enemies, and completing quests until you reach a focal point when you realize you've basically completed the main quest before the story even really begins, and then there's not much left to do at that point besides sailing to the final island to complete your last objectives and defeat the final boss. The other big issue is that the game is just way too easy, even on the highest difficulty, which largely defeats the satisfying feel of Piranha Bytes' typical zero to hero formula, when you're able to defeat endgame main quest bosses at what is effectively level 1 with zero combat training while playing on the highest difficulty. The difficulty was actually a complete and utter joke when the game first launched, because you even had full invincibility while roll dodging, which utterly trivialized difficult fights when you could just spam dodge and avoid all damage. They later patched in an ultra difficulty, which removes the roll dodge invulnerability, adds a cooldown effect to using healing potions, and further tweaks the damage ratios to try to make the game actually somewhat difficult, but it's still surprisingly easy even with all these changes. In the grand scheme of things, Risen 3 represents the first game in these rankings that I feel passes at least a baseline level of acceptability, where it doesn't have any major faults that completely break the game for me like those ones ranked lower on the list, but at the same time it doesn't excel at anything strongly enough to elevate it higher than a middle-of-the-road ranking. Other games have more satisfying combat systems, better role-playing mechanics, more rewarding exploration and progression, more thoroughly developed stories and main quests, or else just more of that traditional Piranha Bytes feel that you look for in a Piranha Bytes game. I actually really liked Risen 3 when I played it originally in 2014, but after my recent replay, having replayed every other Piranha Bytes game more recently, it just felt very run-of-the-mill to me, where most of it is largely derivative of the same things that you can find in other Piranha Bytes games, just not as good in most cases, and without as much creative innovation to make anything stand out. Risen released in October 2009 as the first entry in a brand new series after Piranha Bytes lost the rights to Gothic following their split with their publisher Joe Wood in 2007, shortly after the release of Gothic 3. Set in a world sometime after humanity banished their gods from existence, the formerly imprisoned Titans have risen and started ravaging the world, threatening all of humanity in the process. You play as a nameless stowaway who arrives on the island of Faranga and eventually becomes the key figure in finding a way to prevent the island's destruction at the hands of the mysterious Fire Titan. With a new tropical island setting and a fresh coat of paint over everything, Risen 1 follows the same basic formula as Gothic 1 in what would seem to have been a deliberate effort by Piranha Bytes to scale back their production and release a properly finished game within a set budget and time frame. That was definitely the right call, considering the disastrous development cycle they underwent with Gothic 3 and how poorly that game turned out. As a result, Risen 1 actually feels like a surprisingly well-polished game that had a clear vision behind it, where they actually achieved what they set out to do. That alone makes it better than most of the games ranked lower on this list, but there's more to Risen 1 than merely being competent. For starters, the melee combat system is conceptually the best of any Piranha Bytes game. It has its problems, of course, namely to do with the timing for animations being so fast that you don't usually have a chance to properly react to things, and with rough edges like questionable hitboxes, sometimes unresponsive controls, and the inability to manually choose your target lock. But it puts a lot of specific control in your hands with lots of different moves you can pull off, and with a good balance between player skill and character stats. It's a fundamentally solid basis for an action-based combat system in an RPG, and so it's a shame that we never saw the system refined more in subsequent games. Beyond that, it has a satisfying progression system where level ups are crucial to exploring the world, and with weapon and spell training having 10 skill levels where each level gives you some meaningful new active or passive ability, which is the most depth we've ever had for leveling these skills in any Piranha Bytes game. Then we can also point to the game's wonderfully charming atmosphere, from the tropical island aesthetic to the phenomenal English localization and to Kai Rosenkranz's beautiful soundtrack, which are all really good too. The main thing that makes Risen 1 truly special, however, is that it's the only game Piranha Bytes ever created after Gothic 1 and 2 that actually feels like a proper Gothic game. I don't want to just repeat everything I already covered under Gothic 3 when discussing all the things you think of when you think Gothic game, but Risen checks all of those boxes and then some. They really did just go, okay, here's what we did with Gothic 1, now let's take all these elements and drop them into our new engine, throw in a few other inspirations from Gothic 2, expand on some gameplay mechanics, update some things so they feel more modern, scale back on the scope of some things, and then focus all of our remaining efforts on making sure that everything is as sleek as we can make it. It's so fundamentally similar to Gothic that you could easily call Risen the unofficial Gothic 4. There are even popular fan theories that it takes place in the same world as Gothic, just in a different part of the world, following the Adanos ending of Gothic 3, in which you banish all of the gods. There are even those who would argue that Risen is what Gothic 3 should have been instead of what we actually got with Gothic 3. I'm guessing a lot of people would rank Risen 1 just under Gothic 1 and 2 for that reason alone, and yet obviously that's not the case in my rankings, given that a certain other game still has yet to be mentioned. No idea what that could be. The reason Risen isn't higher in my rankings is because it has the absolute lowest ambition of any Piranha Bytes game, and it shows. Risen 1 is extremely modest in scope, with a relatively small world, a lack of distinct dungeons, and a main quest that only lasts 4 chapters instead of the usual 6 that we had in Gothic 1 and 2. And even then, chapters 3 and 4 are a step down from the first 2 with a repetitive use of copy-pasted lizardman battles that have been spawned all over the island, and with all the dungeon crawling through the same environments, fighting the same enemies and solving the same types of puzzles over and over and over again. And that's more than just a little disappointing to have so much obvious content padding when the game was already so small to begin with. That's not even to mention the weird, gimmicky final boss or the complete lack of an end resolution, which I won't show here to avoid spoilers, that serve as the final nail in the coffin of the game's really lackluster second half. When I played the game at launch, I was pretty lukewarm about everything, basically just appreciating the fact that it was a better game than Gothic 3, but lamenting the fact that it really didn't aspire to be any better than Gothic 1 and 2, while also finding the second half to be an extreme buzzkill. After finishing it once, I was content to put it down and move on to something else, whereas every other game I have ranked higher triggered some deeper fascination within me that compelled me to immediately replay them multiple times. After replaying Risen 10 years later, along with all the other Piranha Bytes games, I've come to appreciate its gothicness a little more, since it's now apparent in retrospect how difficult that is to pull off, considering it's been practically non-existent in any of their subsequent games. That helps a lot with it maintaining a relatively high spot in my rankings. However, I was still really disappointed with its lackluster second half, which is only supplanted by Elex 2 as being the worst second half of any Piranha Bytes game. And although I respect it for setting a more modest goal that could actually be achieved with their budget and manpower, it's hard to feel too impressed by a game with such modest ambitions, hence why it isn't higher in my rankings. Elex released in October 2017 under a new arrangement with a new publisher, THQ Nordic, following the conclusion of the Risen series with Deep Silver. Elex returns to the huge open-world formula they had previously tried with Gothic 3, but this time with a unique blend of fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalypse themes, and a newfound emphasis on vertical exploration via the new jetpack mechanic. You play as Jax, a former ALB commander who was betrayed and left for dead by his order, on a main quest to find out why they betrayed him and ultimately put a stop to their plans to harvest all Elex from the planet. Elex may be the most notoriously janky game in Piranha Bytes' catalog. We can certainly argue that there are technically worse games in this department, but Elex was, I believe, their most commercially successful game and was many people's introduction to Piranha Bytes, so it naturally had more exposure to mainstream media and I think therefore developed more of a reputation among general audiences. Common criticisms deal with some awkward physics that make just controlling jacks while you're running around or flying with the jetpack a little clunky, stiff animations and idiosyncratic combat mechanics that take a lot to get used to put it mildly, an insanely punishing difficulty curve that borders on being outright unfair in the beginning, and a questionable balance with regards to the viability of various weapons and spells, among other things like all the repeated faces and mediocre lip syncing and whatever else. I'm sure many people tried Elex for an hour or less and gave up just because of those issues alone, and the mishmash of such wildly different settings probably rubs some people the wrong way who either don't like one or more of the fantasy, sci-fi, or post-apocalypse elements, or who can't buy those different things all coexisting in one setting. All of which is to say there's a reason someone might want to put Elex lower in their rankings than I have it here. None of these are major deal breakers for me, however. In fact, some of them are actually a positive as far as I'm concerned. I'm a huge fan of the difficulty, for instance, because it really emphasizes that zero to hero progression curve that I love so much about Piranha Bytes games, so getting absolutely curb stomped by even basic enemies at the start of the game is a huge plus as far as I'm concerned. The melee combat is indeed pretty cumbersome at first and not without significant faults, but it has a lot more depth to it with more demand for player skill than other similar types of games, not just Piranha Bytes games, due to its need for timed actions and reactions to build the combo meter while also managing a limited stamina supply. And it really does become pretty smooth and functional once you get the hang of things. Having 6 different movesets for 6 different categories of weapons, each with their own special attacks as well, is also an impressive feat for a Piranha Bytes game that I wish would have carried over to Elex 2. I am also a huge fan of science fiction and post-apocalypse settings, more so than traditional fantasy stuff, which I'm actually completely indifferent towards, so I really appreciate playing a Piranha Bytes game that incorporates elements from those different genres. And contrary to what some other people might say, I actually think they work reasonably well together in this context, with the justification of Elex being this mysterious, all-powerful substance that can be used in all sorts of different ways. You have to suspend quite a bit of disbelief, of course, but they explained everything sufficiently enough for me to buy into this world. It helps too that there's a ton of great lore and backstory going on, with lots to learn about with regards to what the world was like before the comet hit, how the survivors fared immediately after the comet, how the different factions formed around their use of Elex, and even going so far as to uncover hidden secrets about what was really going on around the time the comet was arriving, as well as the true secret behind one of the New World's religions. This is one of the main areas where Elex really excels compared to their other games. Whereas their other worlds are usually richly detailed and highly believable, they don't necessarily have a lot of compelling lore behind them. The worlds are just kind of there, and what you see is what you get. That's not inherently a bad thing, of course, especially seeing as some of those worlds are incredibly atmospheric and immersive, but Piranha Bytes really put a deliberate focus on the world building for this game, with new features like audio logs and a greater emphasis on using written notes and environmental storytelling to make learning about the world itself a more actively engaging component of the game design. I, for one, felt a deep fascination with this world in particular, with a lot of my drive to explore the world and experience all of its content being based on my simple desire to learn more about it. The other reason I rank Elex so highly is because it has the most depth and variety and role-playing mechanics of any Piranha Bytes game. For as much as I love Piranha Bytes games, the actual RPG mechanics in their other games are relatively simple. Gothic 1, for example, only has 2 stats, I guess 3 if you count mana, 2 levels of sword training, and just a handful of other skills that are often just binary yes or no effects on the gameplay, like do you have the sneak skill, yes or no. Subsequent games have progressively expanded on this with more stats, more skills, more levels to skill training, and so on, but Elex represents the culmination of all the series' evolution, with refining systems that were introduced but not fully realized in previous games, and while even adding several new mechanics of its own. For one, we've now got actual skill checks and dialogue, which I love for how it thematically turns your character's unique gameplay-based mechanical skills into more conceptual representations of your theoretical understanding of a given subject. That's so much more interesting and rewarding to me than so many other RPGs where dialogue skills tend to just be your basic persuade or intimidate options, and they're likewise more unique in execution than standard attribute checks. Then you've got the cold meter, which is an evolution of the soul meter from Risen 3, which acts as a karma system to measure not just how good or evil you are like most other karma meters typically are, but instead how emotional you are. This is a wonderful system because it has so much more nuance and depth, with more gray areas as to what the supposedly best choice is in any given situation, since emotional responses can be both good or bad depending on the context. And of course, this meter has actual consequences on the gameplay, with certain quests and dialogue options requiring a certain range to select certain options or to benefit from certain skills, while also determining the ending that you'll ultimately receive. Then you throw in other things like companion characters with affinity meters that react to your decisions, a couple romance options if you care about that.
Forget the elves. It's really about your ass. I'm bringing the free people together because of your ass.
3 different endings, stat requirements for weapons and armor, which was missing in some of the Risen games and frankly many other RPGs in general, and Elex just winds up offering a much more crunchy, satisfying RPG experience as far as what I enjoy in my RPGs. There's also something to be said about it being a massive open world that also has a linear, chapter-based story that holds up surprisingly well over the course of its full runtime. It has some of that Risen 3 syndrome where it's possible to do most of the game's content in Chapter 1, but unlike Risen 3, or Elex 2, or Risen 1, it has more meaningful quest events with unique scenarios and interesting story revelations that occur later in the game, so I found the main quest to be engaging the whole way through. The map is admittedly bigger than I'd really like it to be, and I ultimately prefer the style of something like Gothic 2, which is smaller but more densely packed with content and with new areas that unlock as you advance the chapters in addition to more dynamic changes happening to familiar areas. But of all the massive open world games I've ever played, Elex is easily one of my favorites because the world is still more detailed and more rewarding to explore than many other options out there, and the jetpack offers a lot of fun novelty with exploring this world in creative ways that are truly unique to this game. It can't beat Gothic 1 or 2 in my rankings, however, because it does have plenty of legitimate objective faults, and ultimately it didn't leave as much of a legacy and wasn't really as revolutionary for its time, hence why those games are higher. And now we come to the inevitable top of the list, where Gothic 1 and 2 will duke it out to determine which game will reign supreme. As I said earlier, I always like to consider these as basically one game split into 2 parts, so it's really difficult to choose between them. It's even harder to talk about them separately since they're so similar in so many ways that most of what I could say praising one game would apply equally to the other. So instead, I'll talk about them collectively for a bit and then break down the specific differences in their individual entries. Note that I've already gone into detail describing a bunch of things that made Gothic 1 and 2 such great games in a previous video, and I don't want to just repeat myself here or turn this ranking video into a full retrospective review, so I'd recommend watching that video if you want to know more about why these games were so great for their time and how they still hold up really well even today. Gothic 1 and 2 are some of my favorite games of all time because they were a perfect combination of being a rare type of special game that transcended what other games were doing at the time, while also coming along at a formative time in my teenage years when I was really starting to take video games more seriously. These were such an eye-opening experience for me with their fascinating world design, rewarding exploration, immersive atmosphere, realistic NPCs and creature behaviors, compelling challenge, respectful lack of hand-holding, engaging combat system, intriguing quest design, practical RPG mechanics, and satisfying progression that it basically ruined all other similar types of games for me. Trying to play Morrowind after Gothic 1 and 2, for example, just left me feeling dead inside because of how poorly that game failed to live up to the things I enjoyed about Gothic, despite them being ostensibly similar types of games. So in the grand scheme of things, Gothic 1 and 2 are at the top of my list for largely personal reasons, just because of the profound impact they had on me as a gamer. But with that being said, they are still solid games that do a lot of things extremely well, since the things that made them such good games in the early 2000s are timelessly brilliant, and in fact are still better than many games that have come out in the 20 plus years since. Where the early Gothic games shine relative to the other subsequent Piranha Bytes games is just their strong atmosphere that leads to an incredibly believable and immersive world. Many of the usual tricks that they sort of pioneered in the early days of 3D RPGs carry over into subsequent games, of course, like NPCs having daily schedules and being involved with ambient activities throughout the day, or how every single character in the game is fully voice acted, or how they react to your actions around them in realistic ways. However, there are plenty of other details that remain unique to Gothic 1 and 2 that, for some reason, never appeared in any subsequent game, or else were never implemented as strongly. Mike Hoga describes the presiding design philosophy for Gothic 1, coined by fellow Piranha Stefan Newell as "what you see is what you get." basically meaning that they wanted to express all of the vital information of this world in a way that you could intuit everything just by looking at it. In essence, you should be able to tell that a particular sword does more damage than another because it is longer, has sharper edges, a more ornate hilt, or some other sort of visual indication besides just looking at an arbitrary number on a stat screen. This is especially true of the early Gothic games, and starts falling off later on as weapon models and damage values start becoming incredibly arbitrary, with needing to rely on naming conventions like Hunting Bow 1 and Hunting Bow 2 to indicate quality levels. This applies to the combat system as well, with you being able to tell that different people are more proficient fighters just by the stance they use when holding their weapon, since there are 3 entirely different animation sets for combat mastery. You go through this skill progression yourself, first holding your one-handed sword with 2 hands and swinging it like a baseball bat, and then holding it properly once you get some sword training and progressively unlocking faster and longer combos to visually show that you are now a more proficient fighter. This makes you feel like a stronger fighter since it applies practical changes to the combat system in a more tangible sort of way than simply increasing damage numbers in the background like most combat systems and subsequent Piranha Bytes games ultimately do. At the most, those other games just give you a couple extra special attacks that you can perform, while others are literally just passive statistical boosts. Another big thing is that their worlds feel plausibly real in a way that I don't think the other games are as good at achieving. A lot of effort was put into the early Gothic games specifically to really show how all these worlds live and operate, with each camp in Gothic 1 having a justification for how they procure the foods and equipment they need to survive, and showing them actually going about their business to accomplish their objectives, while Gothic 2 shows how most folks in town are working class citizens with various professions, while those who aren't have lost their jobs due to the war and martial law set by the paladins, now struggling to support themselves in this new economy, or else belong to the upper class and can survive on their established wealth for the time being, and that most of the land outside of town is dedicated to various farms who work to supply the island with food. Even with the creatures, you can feel a sense of their own liveliness in terms of this is the type of food these creatures eat, these are the types of environments they like to live in, this is their motivation for why they would behave a certain way, so they feel like natural parts of the world. With most of the later games, I get the feeling like there wasn't as much care put into establishing the fine details for how the worlds actually operate, with creatures and NPCs often just dropped into the maps in random locations just to fill out space, and with a lot more missing information that would help to flesh out the worlds better, or just random stuff that just doesn't make logical sense in the first place. Sure, they technically check a lot of the same boxes as the early Gothic games, but it's like there's no specific intent behind it all to suggest the why or the how of everything. Maybe I'm just biased because I like Gothic 1 and 2 so much, and thus I'm able to perceive those intentions in those games but not in the others as much. Or maybe it's because those other games really are just a little more surface level in their depictions of everything. Either way, the end result is that I just don't feel as convinced by the worlds in other games and don't feel as strongly immersed within them. Later games also start introducing more video gamey elements that I feel progressively start to distract from the immersion a bit. Starting with Gothic 3 and onward, we get things like on-screen hotbars and compasses and more detailed map screens and mini-maps and skull icons over enemies and GPS-style quest markers and quasi-stamina meters glued to your character model and glaring item targeting outlines and journal entries that feel like a generic quest log and not a handwritten journal from the character's perspective, and abstract stat screens where you increase attributes from a window instead of needing to find someone or something in the environment to train yourself with, and probably more stuff that I'm forgetting, all of which feels like artificial video game crap bleeding into my wonderfully pure, immersive role-playing experience. The Gothic games are so sleek without all those extraneous elements. Just cycling through equipped runes and weaponry by spinning runes through the air or grabbing for the different weapons on your body is so much more immersive than having an on-screen hotbar or game-pausing quick-use menu wheel for everything. And the lack of more detailed map screens and mini-maps and quest markers adds to that feeling like you're actually in these worlds, forced to engage with them on a more direct level to keep track of where you're going and to find what you need, versus these more modern games that practically force you to use things like quest markers because the quest design and map design aren't good enough to allow you to follow natural instructions and figure things out on your own. Gothic 1 and 2 offer a perfect sweet spot in map size and density, where they're big enough to provide plenty of open world freedom with lots of opportunity for non-linear exploration, but then small enough to actually be manageable and exploring everywhere, with detailed environments that cram lots of worthwhile content into the folds of this smaller space to the point that it's actually worth exploring everywhere possible. Quite simply, I remember every square inch of the maps in Gothic 1 and 2 and still enjoy exploring them even on repeat playthroughs, whereas the bigger, more bloated maps of most of the subsequent games are largely hollow, with a lot of their landmass explicitly intended to be ignored as you move past it to reach something else. Thus, they wind up being somewhat forgettable to me and so not as good. There's more stuff I could talk about with regards to why I'm putting these two at the top, but I'm starting to get into ranting territory, and again, I don't want this ranking video to go on forever on every little detail, so I hope I've explained enough to justify myself with these choices. Although the games are older than anything else on this list, and thus could be argued to be not as good as more modern games due to their relative age or apparent simplicity, and even though I do ascribe a lot of personal value to these games with the impact they had on me, I don't think it's just nostalgia on my part putting them on top, because I feel like they really do some clever, unique, and effective things that are simply better than what Piranha Bytes managed with their subsequent games. With all of that said, which one of them is the better game? For the sake of my rankings, I'm going to put Gothic 2 next in order, with Gothic 1 just above it.
He is weak and has forgotten much. But he is alive. He's back.
Originally released in Germany in November 2002, with staggered releases to the rest of Europe and North America up to 11 months later, Gothic 2 takes place almost immediately after the first game and acts as a direct sequel, carrying over all the same characters and even some of the same settings from Gothic 1. After saving the prison colony from a demonic being, you awaken sometime later after having been trapped in the debris from the destruction of the final boss's temple, essentially brought back to life by your necromancer friend Zardus, having lost all of your old strength in the process. You're then promptly set on a new quest to acquire the mystical Eye of Innos so that you can defeat the dragons who've been summoned to Corinus and stop the armies of darkness from destroying the island. Technically speaking, Gothic 2 is actually the better game than Gothic 1, due to it being a sequel and having the opportunity to build off of an established foundation, whereas Gothic 1 had to create all of the main concepts and core mechanics from scratch, which ultimately took up the vast majority of their development time.
But the content of the game was done, 80% was done in the last 4 months, actually. The combat AI, most of the dialogues, most of the quests, and so forth, even the daily routines. We got all the systems in place, and then we had a plan, and then we just executed it with 80-hour weeks.
With all the groundwork already laid from Gothic 1, they were able to focus more of their effort in the sequel on polishing existing mechanics, adding new features for extra depth and variety, and creating a bunch of all new content in a bigger, more complex environment. The map design is probably Gothic 2's greatest strength relative to Gothic 1, with it somehow managing to not only be multiple times bigger than Gothic 1's, but also much more dense in the process. In comparison, the map in Gothic 1 is relatively small, and has a lot of areas without a lot to really see or do within them, which can make exploration feel a little less exciting. In Gothic 2, there's a lot more hidden loot placed in out-of-the-way areas if you think to explore off the beaten path, and there are likewise more unique bits of side content to discover, with NPCs and special items and fun enemy encounters and interesting level designs seemingly everywhere you look. The actual map also has more different zones to explore, with more deliberate pathways creating more specific challenges to overcome, and a greater emphasis on verticality to create interesting obstacles and allow for more literal depth in the environments. Exploration is therefore much more mechanically engaging in Gothic 2, with more total content to experience and more practical rewards to discover in the process. There's also a cool way that the maps change from chapter to chapter as you advance through the main quest, unlocking entirely new maps and then returning to old ones where some new event has subtly changed the situation with new enemies and new questing opportunities. This helps to keep the gameplay fresh and exciting since there's always something new to see and do in subsequent chapters, and it gives the world a greater sense of liveliness to it with how much things change as a result of the main quest, with NPCs actually reacting to these changes in a realistic way. Gothic 1 doesn't really do this with its open world. There's only one moment when the world state changes, but it doesn't really affect the open world much itself, and there's practically no new side content to experience beyond Chapter 1, so after you've explored the map once, there's nothing else to do in the open world besides just running across the map to your next main quest event for the entire rest of the game. This has the unfortunate side effect of making the world feel somewhat empty and lifeless beyond a certain point in the story, whereas Gothic 2 does a better job of reincorporating familiar areas into new quest events and giving you more optional things to experience in each chapter. The RPG mechanics are also fleshed out better, pretty much across the entire board. There are plenty of new skills to learn, with things like blacksmithing and alchemy now being turned into actual skills, where higher skill investments will yield better rewards, and with other things like animal skinning, pickpocketing, and lockpicking now having much more viable utility, in addition to actually being necessary in the case of lockpicking.
I know nothing about picking locks.
Combat skills are also expanded, with more progressive stages to mastering each type of weapon training and needing to spend learning points to be able to craft individual runes. And the factions have likewise been given more differentiating gameplay mechanics, with each one having access to their own specialized set of skills, different learning point costs and ways to improve different stats, and more unique side quests. This all helps to flesh out the RPG mechanics and makes the progression system feel a bit more satisfying, since it takes a little more effort and deliberate allocation of more limited resources to maximize your character, with more ways to customize your character, whereas it was all pretty simple and straightforward in Gothic 1. The net effect of these improvements is that the raw gameplay in Gothic 2 is just a straight up improvement over Gothic 1. If that's all you care about, then Gothic 2 will obviously be the better game. However, it does suffer when it comes to its story, main quest, and overall atmosphere, which are just a few of the reasons I'm putting Gothic 1 above it in my rankings.
Welcome to the colony.
Originally released in Germany in March 2001, with European and North American releases coming 6 to 12 months later, Gothic is the first game by Piranha Bytes, which began development in 1997 with just 4 guys who had an idea and 3 programmers who came to them with a game engine. In Gothic, you play a nameless convict thrown into a magically encapsulated prison colony that was originally established to mine magic ore to supply the king's army in the war against the orcs. Forced to fend for yourself in this brutal dog-eat-dog world, you eventually become the key figure in uncovering the existence of a mysterious deity who threatens all life in the colony and eventually finding a way to stop it. Despite being a much smaller and simpler game than its sequel, Gothic 1 does manage to do a few important things better. The story and main quest, for instance, are just much more developed, which can be reason enough to argue that Gothic might be a more interesting game overall. There's a real sense of mystery and intrigue to the plot as you start the game as a random nobody just trying to find a way to make a living for yourself, and then slowly get involved in a series of events that reveal something sinister is going on within the barrier, and that the swamp camp's deity that they pray to might not be what it seems. The story just kind of emerges naturally from the world itself, with even a bit of foreshadowing in the letter you're given at the start of the game to deliver to the fire mages, should you choose to break the seal and read it yourself, which combined with the subject matter and the way the mystery is revealed is just better than Gothic 2 coming out from the get-go like, there's dragons, we gotta go kill them.
Dragons?
Gothic 2's story has some interesting twists and complications, of course, and like I said, I really appreciate how the world changes in each chapter to reflect the rising stakes of the main threat, but it's always felt to me like it was more about establishing a premise for a bunch of gameplay objectives than it was about telling an actual story. The main quest also just has more stuff going on in Gothic 1, with more unique locations to visit like the old mine where you have to descend through its dark labyrinthine tunnels looking for mechanical parts to open the gate so that you can reach the mine crawler queen's lair, and the new mine where you have to fight off old camp invaders and find an orc who will make you an Ulu Mulu so you can roam around the orc village in safety, or the orc cemetery where you set out with a group of Templars to investigate the sect leader's vision, which progressively drives the guru in charge of the expedition to madness, and the Temple of the Sleeper, which is the biggest and most complex dungeon in any Piranha Bytes game, with a ton of legit puzzles and platforming elements to navigate on your way to reaching the final boss. I'm especially fond of dungeon crawling in these games, and Gothic 1 trumps every other game in this department, so that's a solid point in its favor for me. Then you throw in other things like acquiring the Focus Stones, where you meet with key NPCs like Diego, Milton, Gorn, and Lester to investigate weird locations and perform more extraordinary tasks, like shrinking down a troll so you can reach the gate winch in safety, or transforming into a meat bug so you can get inside the abandoned monastery, and I just find myself having a lot more fun with Gothic 1's main questline. There's also something to be said about the atmosphere and the setting itself. Gothic 1 is just so much more unique in this regard, with its fantasy prison setting and the way the different societies formed around what they were able to accomplish within the limited confines of the magic barrier and what they were hoping to accomplish by branching out from the old system. The sort of lawless anarchy that pervades the colony, where the strongest write the rules and everyone else falls in line or else be cast out to survive on their own, with dangerous beasts prowling the lands between camps, including the dreaded orcs in the neighboring lands that got trapped inside the barrier, adds a brutally harsh tone to everything, with also a hint of foreboding eeriness in light of the mysterious, crumbling ruins of the people who once lived in these lands before it was turned into a prison. Meanwhile, Gothic 2 is relatively bright and cheery in the main map of Corinus, with a much more modern, civilized civilized sort of atmosphere, complete with a bustling harbor city and plentiful farmlands that all give off a more generic fantasy vibe, especially when you factor in the main plot being about defeating dragons. It's still an incredibly rich and immersive setting thanks to the effort Piranha Bytes put into all the world building, but if I had to choose one that I like more, it would be Gothic 1's prison colony. Finally, I just have to give respect to Gothic 1 as a founding effort of this studio. Without Gothic 1, we wouldn't have had Gothic 2 or any of the other great games to have come afterward. Piranha Bytes set such an incredibly high bar with their first effort, which impressively has only ever been matched by its immediate successor that copied so much of Gothic 1's original DNA. It was truly ahead of its time and something of a revolution for the genre that just completely blew my mind when I played it for the first time. As much as I love Gothic 2 for all the extra polish and mechanical improvement it brought to the equation, I ultimately appreciate the profound innovation involved with conceiving such a tremendous first game, and thus have to put Gothic 1 ahead in my own rankings. Which finally brings us to my number 1 in these rankings, Arcania Gothic 4. Nah, I'm just kidding, my real number 1 is Gothic 3 Forsaken Gods. Nah, I'm just kidding, my real number 1 is Arcania Fall of Satarif. Nah, I'm just kidding. My real number 1 is Gothic 3, The Beginning. Nah, I'm just kidding. My real number 1 is Gothic 2, specifically with the Night of the Raven expansion.
A mighty artifact, so it is written in the old scriptures, will be brought back to this world when the god of darkness sends his henchmen out to search.
Originally released in Germany in August 2003, less than a year after Gothic 2, Night of the Raven is an expansion for Gothic 2 that adds a new map and major questline into the middle of Gothic 2's main story, while also completely rebalancing the base game and incorporating lots of extra quests and new mechanics to the existing chapters of the original game. So rather than being something that is simply added on to the end of the base game as purely extra content, it's more of an add-in with elements of a full game remastering. With Night of the Raven, you become aware of a new threat to the island of Corinus and a previously undiscovered region of the map as it becomes apparent that Raven, one of the Ore Barons from Gothic 1, has led a group of old camp refugees into the ancient land of Jarkandar to claim a powerful artifact of Beliar for himself. Putting Night of the Raven at number 1 might be a technicality because it also includes Gothic 2, which I already ranked separately in the list, especially seeing as the Gold Edition, which includes the expansion, has become the default version of Gothic 2 as that's the only version you can buy these days. But it's worth remembering that there was a time when Night of the Raven didn't exist and all we had was Gothic 2 by itself. For those of us in the US, we had to wait a whole 2 years before receiving Night of the Raven, so I was well aware of what the base game was like and can easily separate the two in my mind. At the end of the day, they are two different versions of the game, so I've opted to rank them separately. And despite ranking Gothic 2 below Gothic 1, I'm putting Night of the Raven in my number 1 spot. Now, there's probably an argument to be made that Night of the Raven actually makes Gothic 2 worse. For one, it messes with the pacing of the base game by being shoehorned into the middle of the main plot, where you're told there's a pressing need to stop the dragons, but then all of a sudden there's also this other random side quest that you're actually forced to take care of before you can actually stop the dragons. It also makes the game a lot more difficult by adjusting enemy damage values higher, in addition to overhauling the learning costs for stat and skill improvements by making them cost progressively more and more as you level up. This, in turn, kind of forces you into a more tedious, metagaming, min-maxing style of gameplay where you have to plan your build more carefully and avoid using permanent stat potions until later in the game, because they actually count against your progression in terms of future learning point costs. And if I'm remembering correctly, Night of the Raven is the one responsible for making the damage formula overly reliant on critical hits, by making regular hits do practically nothing while critical hits do insane damage, thus making a lot of fights in the early game wildly swingy. None of that stuff really bothers me, however. Okay, the critical hit thing is kind of annoying, but I've never had an issue with the expansion disrupting the pacing of the base game because I was always just so elated to have more content for Gothic 2 that I was happy to experience it in any way, shape, or form. And although the revamped learning point costs can be a little tedious sometimes, especially with the potions and other things counting against you, it was frankly a little too easy in the base game to max your character early on, and so I appreciate having that extra degree of difficulty all across the board to make it a more challenging game as a returning player. The one thing that I find to be a bit of a buzzkill with Night of the Raven is that the amount of content can be overwhelming. There's a lot of extra stuff going on in Chapter 1, and it can be exhausting keeping track of everything in terms of who you've talked to, where you've been, what quests you followed up on, and so on. They also added tons of new enemies with bandits everywhere and stone sentinels to fight, among other things, so a lot more of the gameplay gets bogged down with extended periods of just fighting stuff. In fact, with the new combat difficulty and scaling learning point costs, it makes grinding experience by killing all the enemies on every map feel like more of a necessity just to keep up with the game. That applies to all the base game content as well, which I did find to be somewhat exasperating on my recent replay by the time I got into chapters 4 and 5 while fighting all the hordes of orcs and lizardmen. Despite that, I just really like all the new content in Night of the Raven. I really enjoyed the new quests added to Korenis in Chapter 1 with finding the missing people and locating the bandit's weapons dealer, because they're surprisingly widespread with an open detective-like premise that requires you to talk to a bunch of people and follow various plot threads on your own to figure everything out. I love the look of the new map with its diverse environments that are completely unlike anything we'd ever seen before in the previous games, and even though it is a little more linear in areas, I think that works for the sake of the expansion being this more focused little adventure. I like the atmosphere of the pirate beach and doing quests for everyone there, and then going undercover to infiltrate the bandit camp in the swamp. I love all the new music and consider many of these tracks to be among my favorite of any Piranha Bytes game. I like seeing all the older characters return from Gothic 1 who were previously absent in Gothic 2 and getting to learn more about what happened after the fall of the barrier. I like learning about the long-lost civilization of the builders and solving their puzzles. I like having one more little dungeon in the game, which Gothic 2 was somewhat lacking on. And it's fun to see so many new weapons, armor, spells, items, creatures, and all the other little things that got added to Gothic 2. On top of that, it just rounds Gothic 2 into a much bigger, fuller game experience with an insane amount of depth, complexity, and variety that it becomes an amazing value for just how much quality content you can experience within this single game. But mainly, I just have a special fondness for Night of the Raven because it allowed me to experience Gothic 2 for the first time all over again. I loved those first two games so much that it was pure magic to play a new version of one of my favorite games, and having to wait 2 years for the North American version with long-standing rumors that it might never make its way to the US made it all the more special to finally get that chance. Playing Night of the Raven was like living through a part of my childhood again, even though I was far from a child when I played Gothic 2 originally, and even though it was only 2 years prior, so it will always be special to me for that reason alone.
Does this mean that your mission was successful?
Yes, Raven is dead.
Then it is over. Thank Adanos.
And so that's how I would rank all of the Piranha Bytes games. Picking the specific ranks is a little difficult in some cases, as I could maybe see a few games flipping positions with each other, but overall I feel pretty solid about that order. Like I said before, I have my own biases and preferences, so my thoughts on these games are not going to reflect everyone else's uniformly. I know a lot of people absolutely love Gothic 3, for instance. While I can't share those sentiments personally, I can't deny anyone else for liking what they like, and I'm not trying to change anyone else's opinion here. So once again, I would encourage everyone to share your own rankings and express why you like certain games so we can have as much representation for Piranha Bytes' games as possible. If you've made it this far and you've enjoyed this video, then please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video. It really helps me out and I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.